I've always been fascinated by the tug of war between tradition and modernity, especially when it plays out inside institutions that claim to be moral beacons of the world. One of the most glaring examples of this, in my view, is the ongoing refusal by the Catholic Church to allow women to become priests. In a world where women lead governments, run corporations, fly fighter jets, and make life or death decisions in courtrooms, the idea that they still can't stand at the altar and deliver a sermon feels outdated. Actually, let us be honest, it feels wrong. Now, I understand tradition has its place. There's something sacred about preserving rituals that connect us to centuries of human history. I respect that. But when tradition becomes a cage, when it stops being a bridge to the past and instead becomes a wall blocking progress, that's when we have a problem. And that's exactly what's happening here. The church isn't protecting a spiritual truth by keeping women out of priesthood. It's protecting power, hierarchy, and patriarchy. People often say, but this is how it's always been, as if that's a valid excuse. Slavery was also something we always had. Women were once barred from voting too. But society evolves. Our understanding of morality and justice deepens. The refusal to even discuss the idea of women priests, as recent popes have insisted, isn't just stubborn, it's dangerous. It sends a message loud and clear that women are spiritually inferior, somehow less capable of embodying divine authority. I've spoken to women who feel deeply called to the priesthood. Their faith is unwavering, their devotion undeniable. But instead of being embraced, they're sidelined. Instead of being heard, they're silenced. Can you imagine having a calling so powerful it shapes your entire identity, only be told by a man that your gender disqualifies you, that your soul might be pure enough to pray, but your body disqualifies you from leading? Let me be clear, this isn't about attacking faith. It's about questioning whether faith is being used as a shield to protect inequality. We've seen it before. Faith used to justify apartheid, colonialism, segregation. And every time it took people brave enough to speak out before change began. We're at that same crossroads now. There are those who argue that Jesus only chose male apostles, so the church must follow that example. But Jesus also spoke to women when others wouldn't. He lifted up the voices of the marginalized. He shattered social norms wherever he went. If he were here today, would he really support this continued exclusion? I doubt it. In fact, I think he'd be flipping a few tables over it. And the irony, the church relies heavily on women. They make up the majority of congregations. They volunteer, they teach, they fundraise, they nurture communities. They are the backbone of parish life. Yet, when it comes to spiritual leadership, they're told to sit down, to be silent, to leave that space to men. It's not just unjust, it's ungrateful. What's worse, this resistance to progress is costing the church dearly. Attendance is falling. Young people are walking away. Not because they've lost faith, but because they're tired of hypocrisy. They're tired of watching institutions preach love and equality from pulpits that women aren't even allowed to stand behind. Change doesn't come easily in institutions as old as the Catholic Church. But the fact that something is ancient doesn't mean it's sacred. Sometimes it just means it hasn't been challenged hard enough. I'm not saying every tradition should be thrown out, but we have to be brave enough to ask, who does this tradition serve? And who does it hurt? I've interviewed bishops. I've debated with cardinals. I've asked them point blank, why not women? And their answers are always the same. Tradition, doctrine, theology. But never reason, never logic, never anything that truly justifies this exclusion in a world where equality should be the baseline, not a luxury. Some churches have made the leap. The Anglican Church, for example, now orders women. And guess what? The sky didn't fall. The faith didn't crumble. In fact, many communities grew stronger, more connected. So the idea that allowing women to become priests would somehow damage the church is not only absurd, it's insulting to the intelligence of believers everywhere. This issue cuts deeper than gender. It's about representation. It's about acknowledging the full humanity and divinity of every person. It's about telling young girls that they can be more than helpers. They can be leaders, spiritual guides, moral voices. I'm not naive. I don't expect the Vatican to suddenly change its mind tomorrow, but conversations spark movements, and movements create momentum. If enough voices demand better, if we stop treating this issue as untouchable, then maybe, just maybe, we'll live to see a church that finally practices what it preaches. Until then, we have to keep asking the hard questions, because silence in the face of injustice is complicity, and I, for one, won't be complicit in a system that tells women they're not worthy of the pulpit. Not now. Not ever. I've always found it fascinating and honestly frustrating how fiercely the Vatican resists the idea of women becoming priests. It's not just opposition. It's absolute, immovable, ironclad refusal, not up for discussion, not open to debate, not even a question worth asking, apparently. That kind of resistance doesn't come from faith, it comes from fear. Fear of change, fear of losing control, fear that the very foundations of power within the church might start to crack. I remember watching Pope John Paul II speak with such authority, such certainty, declaring that the church has no authority whatsoever to confer priestly ordination on women. And just like that, the door was slammed shut. Not left ajar, not even bolted with a key to be used later, slam locked and guarded like a sacred vault. And then came Pope Benedict, who didn't just maintain that stance, he took it a step further. He said that even EU discussing women priests was off limits, as in, you could actually be disciplined for bringing it up. That's not spiritual leadership. That's censorship. Now, Pope Francis, who many see as a more progressive, modern voice, has danced around the issue. He speaks of women with reverence, calls for more roles for them in the church, praises their gifts. But still, when it comes to priesthood, he falls in line. Same wall, just with a slightly more compassionate voice standing in front of it. He's floated the idea of women deacons, maybe, someday. But even that feels like a consolation prize, a side role, something to keep people quiet while the real power remains where it always has, in the hands of men. And let's not pretend this is about doctrine alone. Doctrine evolves. It always has. At one point, the church defended slavery. At another, it opposed science that contradicted the Bible. But over time, it adjusted, shifted, admitted its errors, because it had to. Because the world moved on, and the church was either going to change or be left behind. So, why now? Why not here on the question of women priests? The truth is, ordaining women doesn't threaten faith. It threatens patriarchy. It threatens the centuries-old hierarchy that keeps a certain kind of man in power. And it reveals something the Vatican doesn't want to, admitting that women are just as capable of interpreting scripture, just as capable of offering pastoral care, just as capable of embodying the sacred. And let me say this directly, the idea that a woman can carry and give birth to life, can raise children, lead families, survive trauma, serve communities, and yet somehow can't stand at the altar and preach. That's not theology. That's misogyny wrapped in robes. The papal resistance is often cloaked in phrases like apostolic tradition and the will of Christ. But when you dig deeper, it becomes clear that these aren't divine commands. They're man-made interpretations, cultural biases that have been fossilized over time and now passed off as holy law. Jesus never said, "Don't ordain women." In fact, some of his most faithful followers were women. He entrusted them with messages, appeared to them first after his resurrection. Yet the church treats them like footnotes in their own spiritual story. I've spoken to nuns who've dedicated their entire lives to serving God, caring for the sick, teaching the young, comforting the dying, and even they know there's a ceiling they'll never break, a sacred space they'll never be allowed to enter. They take vows of obedience, but deep down many of them feel the sting of exclusion. They're seen as spiritual mothers, but never as shepherds. And you know what? The younger generation sees it too. They notice the double standard. They question why their faith uplifts the image of Mary, the mother of Jesus, but won't allow a woman to deliver communion. They wonder how a church that talks about dignity, equality, and the beauty of every soul can still operate with rules that feel like they belong to the Middle Ages. I'm not calling for a revolution. I'm calling for reflection, for honesty, for courage. The Pope is not just a guardian of tradition. He's a leader with the power to guide the church into the future. And yet, on this issue, he remains a prisoner of the past. And let's be clear, change won't come from within the Vatican walls alone. It will come when enough Catholics, lay people, priests, theologians, even bishops, begin to say out loud what many already believe in privating, that excluding women from the priesthood is no longer justifiable, no longer defendable, no longer acceptable. History shows us that the church only moves when it's pushed, when the ground beneath it shakes hard enough that even Rome can't ignore it. That's what needs to happen now, not with rage, but with relentless truth. Not with bitterness, but with bold conviction. We've reached a moment where silence is no longer holy, it's harmful. And this papal resistance, this stubborn refusal to even allow a conversation, isn't preserving faith, it's preserving inequality. It's sending a message, whether the church admits it or not, that women are somehow spiritually less, and I refuse to believe that. I believe in a God who calls people, not based on their gender, but their heart, their purpose, their soul, and I believe the day will come when the church finally listens. When it realizes that the voices it's been silencing for centuries are the very voices it needs most. Until then, we keep speaking loudly, clearly, and unapologetically. There's something deeply uncomfortable about watching an institution preach equality from a pulpit built on exclusion. And nowhere is that contradiction more obvious than in the Catholic Church's refusal to ordain women. I've sat through sermons that speak of love, justice, dignity, and the equal worth of every soul, and then watched as those very principles crumble the moment someone asks a simple question, why can't a woman be a priest? The answer isn't theological, it's political, it's historical. And above all, it's hypocritical. I've seen the church bend over backwards to project an image of moral leadership in today's world. It talks about the poor, the oppressed, the marginalized. It supports women's education, celebrates female saints, and proudly showcases nuns who serve in the darkest corners of human suffering. And yet, when it comes to real leadership, spiritual authority, the priesthood, the pulpit, suddenly the story changes. Suddenly, women are not quite called, enough, not quite chosen, not quite fit. It's the ultimate standard. The church will ask women to do everything: care for the dying, run schools, teach the gospel, manage parishes unofficially. Everything except step up to the altar and say, "This is my body." That sacred line, apparently, is reserved for men. No matter how deep her faith, no matter how powerful a call, no matter how much she's already sacrificed. And yet, week after week, millions of women keep showing up. They volunteer, they tithe, they teach Sunday school, bake for parish events, raise funds for missions, and serve their communities quietly and faithfully. They are the lifeblood of most churches. And what do they get in return? A front row seat to their own exclusion, a pat on the head, a thank you and a no. I've spoken with Catholic women who say they feel honored to serve God in any capacity. But when I ask them privately if they believe they should be allowed to become priests, their eyes say what their mouths sometimes continue, of course they should. They just know the fight is big, the resistance too old, the rules too rigid. But here's the twist. These same women are often the ones the church turns to when it wants to show the world how modern and inclusive it's become. They're paraded at Vatican panels, pictured in glossy reports, celebrated in speeches. Look, we support women. Just don't ask us to share power with them. Don't ask us to let them lead Mass. Don't ask us to change. That's not inclusion. That's optics. That's performative progress. It's almost like the church is trying to have it both ways, be seen as progressive to keep younger generations engaged, especially in a world rapidly losing its religion, but still clinging to the traditions that maintain its male-dominated hierarchy. It wants to champion human rights while clinging to rules that deny half of humanity a voice in the very core of its spiritual life. And this isn't just about women. It's about integrity. If you preach equality but practice exclusion, people notice. If you quote Jesus talking about lifting up the lowly but won't lift up women into leadership, people start asking questions. And those questions don't go away just because you ignore them. They grow louder. I've asked priests, bishops, even a few cardinals why the contradiction, and their answers are rarely satisfying. It's tradition. It's doctrine. It's not in our authority to change. That last one always stings the most. Not in your authority. Whose authority is it then? Because if the church claims to be led by the Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit is moving through millions of women with the passion and desire to serve, then maybe the real sin is ignoring it. And it's not just Catholics asking these questions. The world is watching. Other denominations have already made the shift. The Anglican Church ordains women. So do many Protestant branches. And guess what? They're still standing. Their churches didn't collapse. Their faith didn't implode. If anything, many of them are thriving precisely because they finally aligned their message with their practice. The Catholic Church could do the same. It has the reach, the influence, the moral weight to lead on this issue, to show that faith is not frozen in time, but alive, evolving, and responsive to the world around it. But it won't, not yet, because admitting the need for change would mean admitting that it's been wrong. And institutions like this one don't like to admit they're wrong. But here's the thing. They've done it before, eventually. Slowly, painfully, they've apologized for their role in slavery, for their silence during the Holocaust, for the abuse scandals that shattered countless lives. Each time, too late. Each time only after being forced by truth too loud to ignore. So maybe that's what needs to happen again. Maybe more voices need to rise up. More believers need to say, this is not okay, not with anger, not with rebellion, but with love, with clarity, with the unshakable belief that the church can be better. Because here's what I believe: true faith doesn't hide behind tradition. It challenges us to be better. True leadership doesn't fear change. It welcomes it when it aligns with justice. And any institution that claims to speak on behalf of God should, at the very least, be able to look a woman in the eye and say, yes, you too. You are worthy. You are called. Until that day comes, the church's progress will always be tainted by hypocrisy. Its message will always ring a little hollow, and people will continue to walk away, not from God, but from a system that refuses to practice what it preaches. And I don't blame them. It's hard to ignore the shift that's happening all around us. You can feel it in conversations, see it in protests, hear it in music, politics, social media. Culture is changing, and fast. What used to be sacred simply because it was old is no longer safe from scrutiny. Institutions are being asked tough questions. Who do you serve? Who do you silence? And perhaps more importantly, are you willing to include? That's the climate the Catholic Church finds itself in today. A world that's asking for transparency, equality, justice, and a church that, in many ways, is still clinging to an outdated playbook. Nowhere is this more obvious than in the conversation around women becoming priests. And make no mistaking, the world is talking about it. The only question is whether the church is listening. I grew up seeing the church as this towering moral force, one that shaped law, family, even identity. But today, especially for younger generations, that moral authority is slipping. And it's not because people stopped believing in God. It's because people started believing in equality. We live in a world where women are CEOs, heads of state, military commanders. They teach theology, they lead movements. They serve on the front lines of humanitarian crises. So when the church says women can't be priests, it no longer sounds holy, it sounds hollow. Out of step, detached from reality. Cultural change has made that excuse harder to swallow and honestly impossible to defend. I've spoken to young Catholics who say they love their faith, but they struggle with the institution. They can't reconcile the message of Jesus, who welcomed outcasts, broke rules, and elevated the voiceless, with the rigidity of a church that refuses to evolve. They're not walking away because they're disinterested. They're walking away because they feel unheard. You can feel it in the pews. You can feel it in the silence of missing generations. The church is growing older, grayer, emptier. And it's not just because of secularism. It's because the institution refuses to engage with the world on equal terms. It's stuck defending policies that make less and less sense in the age we're living in. Look around. Culture has shifted to center the value of diversity, of inclusion, not as a trend, but as a truth. If you want to speak to the human experience, you have to speak to all of it, not just the parts led by men. And when it comes to spiritual leadership, that means creating space for women too, not in symbolic roles, not as helpers or support, but as equals, as leaders, as priests. The cultural pressure is real. It's not just coming from the outside anymore. It's bubbling up inside the church. From theologians, from nuns, from lay people, from parishes tired of seeing gifted women held back by outdated rules. And from men, too. Priests and bishops who know the church's credibility is eroding with every year it refuses to adapt. Even Pope Francis, who's often praised as a reformer, has felt that pressure. He's taken small steps, talking about women deacons, forming commissions to study the role of women. But study isn't action. And eventually, symbolic gestures start to feel like stall tactics. Because culture isn't waiting, it's moving on. The question is whether the church will keep up or get left behind. And here's the thing, this isn't about destroying tradition, it's about evolving it, about asking what is tradition for. If it exists to preserve meaning, then it must also reflect truth. And the truth is women have always been spiritual leaders, always. In homes, in communities, in crises. The only difference now is that society is finally recognizing it. I've interviewed women who feel a divine calling to be priests. Not for status, not for rebellion, but because they feel the voice of God asking them to serve. And they're being told, you can pray, you can teach, you can serve, but you can't lead. How does that make sense in a world where leadership isn't bound by gender in any other sphere? Culture is demanding consistency. It's saying, if you preach equality, you must practice it. If you claim to value the human soul, then value it in every form, not just the ones shaped like men in cassocks. Not just the ones fit a centuries-old mold. We are living in an age of accountability, That's not a threat to the church. It's an invitation to look inward, to listen, to lead with courage, not just tradition. Because eventually, the cost of resisting change becomes greater than the cost of embracing it. I don't believe the church has to abandon its roots to grow. But growth is not optional anymore. Not in a world where people see through empty words, where actions are the true gospel, where young Catholics are not afraid to ask, why not us? Why not now? So when we talk about cultural shifts, we're not talking about fleeting fads or pressure from the outside world. We're talking about a deeper awakening, a realization that faith isn't static. It's alive. And if the church wants to remain relevant, respected, and real, it has to step into that truth. Let women lead. Let them preach. Let them bring their full selves to the altar, not as guests, but as equals, because culture is shifting. And eventually, even the oldest institutions will have to shift too, or risk becoming relics of a world that no longer exists.